Senator Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. I rise to give my full support to the bill before us. We are steps that Barbados is going to be, as part of the CARIFORUM group, a member of a new trade agreement which replicates an existing trade agreement with the European Union. We are here in 2019, Mr. Deputy President, having signed the original agreement in it came into provisional application in December of 2008 and was the first agreement for the entire CARIFORUM region, Mr. President, that was on a reciprocal basis. And by that I mean that the agreement which preceded it, the Cotonou Agreement, and in all of our other existing trade agreements, they were on a non-reciprocal basis. Now, for the purpose of the Economic Partnership Agreement, we now have the first reciprocal trade agreement, which meant that we were opening up our markets and we were also taking on obligations that we did not have previously. Mr. President, we have, as a result of this agreement, we had to, the Cotonou Agreement, originally because of that non-reciprocal basis, we had to have a waiver from the World Trade Organization because the agreement itself, because it did not speak to the question of most favored nation treatment, it forced the CARIFORUM countries in the EU to seek a waiver from the WTO provisions in the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, Articles 1 on most favored nations treatment, and Article 5, which spoke to economic integration and regional integration, which meant that if you were outside of the scope of those arrangements, you could not be providing non-reciprocal market access. And so the Economic Partnership Agreement was the successor to that non-compliant WTO agreement. So, Mr. President, having signed the agreement for the first time, which is divided into 6 parts, the agreement has a trade partnership for sustainable development, which is the very first of its kind in a trade agreement. It is not typical for inclusion in a trade agreement, and so this was a significant accomplishment for us to have. In part 2, we had trade and trade-related matters, which included goods, investment and services, current payments and capital movements, and then we had trade-related issues. Part 3, dispute settlement and avoidance. Part 4, general exceptions. Part 5, institutional provisions, and then Part 6, general and final provisions. Now, Mr. President, when we signed this agreement in 2008, there were a number of studies done prior to the signature of the agreement and post the signature of the agreement. We looked at the time, Mr. President, as a region, CARICOM and the Dominican Republic, constituting the CARIFORUM group, at the number of services that were being incorporated into the liberalization commitments. We looked also at the goods and what was being put on offer for the CARICOM region. What goods did we have offensive interest in terms of our export interests, and what goods did we have defensive interest in for us to protect our domestic space. And during that process, Mr. President, conducted under the previous Barbados Labour Party administration, then led by the Right Honourable Owen Arthur, there was an extensive process of national consultations. And when I say national consultations, I want to spend a moment on that, Mr. President, because there has been a lot of discussion around who does not know what is in the agreement. And I want to say definitively that as at 2008, when that agreement was signed, it was signed following extensive consultations under the umbrella business support organizations that covered all of the arrangements, the institutional provisions to which I spoke, the trade-related measures, including investment and so on that I spoke of, the development cooperation measures that I spoke about, and then the specific offensive and defensive interests in terms of goods and services. Those consultations took place, Mr. President, in 2008. And I say that is important because there has been a lot of discussion around the people who do not know about the agreement. And that is important, Mr. President, as we go into this new phase of the agreement. Mr. President, I make no apologies for saying that when I returned to Barbados in 2008, having completed on the one hand, when I left Barbados, in 2008, having completed this agreement in the first place and moved on to the East African region where we began to negotiate the interim economic partnership agreements with the economic community, the East African community with the same European countries. One of the things that I discovered once I returned to Barbados in 2011 and still remains true today, Mr. President, is this. Despite the extensive consultations that took place since 2008 and now, they have remained extraordinarily high level, very technical, and not business oriented. And I want to start by making my first point, Mr. President, to say this. Our academic institutions, our technical institutions, our ministries at the level of policy-making institutions need to change their conversation to speak the language of business, Mr. President. The business community dealing with this agreement, hearing about these agreements, have no interest in hearing about Lomé and Cotonou and MFN and GATT articles and WTO agreements. While that is important information in terms of context and the legal framework, Mr. President, the business community that we want to be able to use this agreement for the purpose of increasing our exports in trade and in goods, in goods and in services, needs to understand, how do I move product A from product B? How do I get it into market A to market B? How do I convert market access into market entry? How do I convert an existing market space into expanded export platforms? How do I do that for my given products and services? And that has been a missing component in this discussion, Mr. President, despite extensive consultations that have taken place since 2008. And so I want to say, Mr. President, our institutions need to understand the language of business. We need to stop talking to each other as if we are all trade experts functioning in an exercise in seeing who knows the most technical jargon, Mr. President. That is not going to get this agreement implemented. And so I'm hoping that with the signature of this agreement and the entry into force of this new UK agreement, that the mistakes that we made up to from 2008 to this date, we do not replicate, because the time has already passed. And we heard that from the acting leader of government business. We heard that from Senator Dr. Holder. We heard some of it as well from Senator Drakes. We don't have the time to do that, Mr. President. So at the institutional level, there are a number of entities there were 5 of them or so, that were put in place to monitor the implementation of this agreement. The Joint Council, the Trade and Development Committee, the Parliamentary Committees, Consultative Committee, and the Special Committee on Customs Cooperation and Trade Facilitation. All of these committees have continuously met, particularly the Trade and Development Committee. They have met. But, Mr. President, the findings of these committees are a bit troublesome. In most instances, Mr. President, and in a report, I'm going to quote from a report that was done in 2014, it's called, and I'm quite happy to have it entered as a document of the House. Mr. President, it's called Monitoring the Implementation and Results of the CARIFORUM EU EPA, final report. It was funded by the European Union and implemented by BNS Europe and LIPINCO, and it is dated September 14th, Mr. President. In that agreement, it covers a number of things. The first thing that it looked at was to what degree the provisions of the CARIFORUM EU EPA have been complied with, both on the CARIFORUM and on the EU side. Secondly, it looked at the available data and economic modeling and made a couple of assumptions. Has the CARIFORUM EU EPA resulted in any measurable impact, qualitative or quantitative, on the trade and development indicators that capture the principles and objectives of the agreement? How does that impact compare with both the expectations at the time of the signature of the agreement and the impact of other external and internal factors? And then finally, Mr. President, what are the key issues that should inform the agenda of the 5-year review and thus increase the implementation and impact of the agreement? Now, Mr. President, those 3 areas are so important simply because in every single area, whether it was on the impact or the implementation, whether we were comparing what was expected and what actually happened, whether we were comparing what was predicted versus what was projected, the implementation measures were few and far between. Now, we're talking about a number of things. What am I talking about when I say that? Talking about legislative measures to be put in place to activate the provisions, the institutions that needed to be created to support implementation. Senator Holder spoke about one of them a short while ago when she said that the EPA implementation unit, which at the time was headed by Ambassador Errol Humphrey, and who was part of the negotiating team, who led the Barbados delegation and the CARIFORUM team into these negotiations, was closed down, Mr. President. We had a single person who woke up every single day, every day of the week, and went to work focusing on implementation. And we closed that down, Mr. President. How do we expect to have implementation monitored at the institutional level? The national and regional strategic plans, frameworks, and roadmaps for implementation, they were all done, Mr. President, in 5-year intervals, but none of them in their entirety ever were implemented. And I'm not just talking about Barbados and Barbados alone. I'm talking about across the CARIFORUM region, but specifically across the CARICOM region, because in the CARIFORUM region we have the Dominican Republic, and every single study tells us that the only country that has implemented this agreement across the CARIFORUM region is the Dominican Republic. And so I want to make that clear, Mr. President, because the notion that the problem here is the agreement and not the users of the agreement becomes an often used refrain. And that is not the truth, Mr. President. How is it, therefore, that the Dominican Republic has been able to be the leading exporter of goods and services under the same agreement that we have not used? If we were to look south, Mr. President, Suriname is also a significant user. We have our special envoy for Suriname here. Suriname, through its relationship with the Netherlands, is also following the Dominican Republic in terms of its utilization of the Economic Partnership Agreement. And so the second point that I want to make, Mr. President, is that the agreement itself is not the problem. Yeah. The agreement itself is not the challenge. The lack of consultation itself is not the challenge. Mr. President, we have to look at the modalities for how we have tried to implement this agreement and why others are using the agreement, the same agreement, in the way that we are not. So, Mr. President, this is interesting because I want to spend a moment on the development cooperation resources that have been poured into the region for the purpose of ensuring that we are able to use the agreement. Mr. President, in 2014, under the EPA capacity building program, the European Union allocated $46.5 million for expenditure in capacity building. Then, under the regional indicative program, they earmarked a further 165 million euros for the purpose of implementation of the agreement. Mr. President, if I go through in the same report on 2014, I can share with you what the areas were for implementation. Mr. President, we talked about economic integration and trade in the OECS. There was CSME and economic integration. There was intra-CARIFORUM trade promotion, and then EPA implementation specifically. And under EPA implementation, we had things relating to statistics, SPS measures, sanitary and phytosanitary programming, TBT, technical barriers to trade, services, RUM, institutional and implementation capacity, EPA focal points and implementation units, Mr. Deputy President, and then you had training, evaluation, and contingencies. So we've established that there was consultation. We've established, Mr. President, that the agreement itself is not the problem because others are using it. Under the development cooperation, Mr. President, we have also established, based on the level of expenditure under the national indicative programs and the regional indicative programs from the European Union, we have established that funding was not the issue, because a significant amount of funding has flowed into the CARIFORUM region since the signature of this agreement to focus on capacity building, Mr. President. So we have to be able to establish in a meaningful way, in an introspective way, Mr. President, what the problem is with this agreement, why it has not been implemented. Mr. President, now I want to use a quote. There is a quote that I liked very much. It's drawn from an article that was written on the CARICOM website. And it brings me to my next point. One of the key things, Mr. President, that was found in the Economic Partnership Agreement was an emphasis on strengthening regional integration and regional integration frameworks. So the agreement is predisposed towards ensuring a deepening of the CSME. The CARICOM single market and economy is built intently on the agreement that we have before us in terms of the EPA. But here's what a writer, Elizabeth Morgan, said in this agreement on CSME. It was written in December 3rd, 2018. Through complacency, poor management, and lack of vision, the West Indies cricket team, for those cricketers among us, is now the sick man of cricket, struggling for a place at the bottom. It is said that the state of cricket in the Caribbean reflects the political, social, and economic state of the region. Since the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas was signed in 2002, complacency, insularity, lack of commitment, and poor management have led to stagnation and discontent in the implementation of the CSME, and consequently, CARICOM has had many missed opportunities to realize its potential. Mr. President, the EPA with the European countries have suffered. We have had significant resources placed through the EDF, the National Indicative Programs, funds that have gone into Caribbean export for private sector development. We've had regional indicative programs that have gone across the CARICOM region, CARIFORUM region, and into the OECS sub-region. And we have also had an emphasis on regional integration. Yet, there are all these missed opportunities, Mr. President. I would wish for us, genuinely, Mr. President, not to externalize this. This is our own failing, Mr. President, as a region and as a nation and as a people, including from the business community. We have to make a change, Mr. President. So with all of this background in mind, here we are today in 2019 with a new agreement, a CARIFORUM UK agreement that has come out of the Brexit process. Now, this is an interesting agreement, and I think Senator Holder, when she spoke earlier, she made a number of important points about particularly the services sector and the responsibility that we have for mutual recognition agreements. Where are we going to go now, Mr. President, with a new agreement that we have not gone in the last few years since 2008? Mr. President, in 2019, it's still ongoing, the EU commissioned another impact study. And we are here now. I'm going to go through it in a bit, but Mr. President, suffice to say that the findings in 2019 are no different than the findings in 2014. Mr. President, 2014 looked at the state of implementation from 2008, and the study which is ongoing now, which is looking at, again, the same two things, implementation and impact, say effectively the same things that the study of 2014 said. We have not implemented the agreement. The impact has not been felt in the way in which it was anticipated. And here we are, Mr. President, with a new agreement waxing philosophical about the importance of trade with third nations, Mr. President. What are we going to do about us? Because that's really where the responsibility lies, with us, Mr. President. And so I want to spend a moment calling for a few things, because the UK agreement is important, and I have here an article which talks about the UK after Brexit. Now, this is as of October 2019. Now, the UK has signed approximately 19 what we call continuity trade deals since since this entire process started. The Caribbean countries are among them. Now, total UK trade is around $1.3 trillion as at last year. About 11% of that came from EU agreements that they have with third countries. Now, the deal with the CARIFORUM countries, including Suriname, we expect to see a number of beneficiaries. Rum, bananas, and sugarcane are all expected to benefit. Now, the total trade between the UK and the CARIFORUM region was about $3.7 billion in 2018. But, Mr. President, I want to spend a moment talking about sugar, bananas, and to a lesser extent, bauxite. I call our arguments over those commodities Stockholm Syndrome. Mr. President, Under Cotonou and prior to the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union being of the EU, of the UK, and then the EU being reviewed, Mr. President, we found ourselves in a situation. Yes, we had duty-free, quota-free market access to the Europeans at a guaranteed price. Senator Holder said it brilliantly. But the world has changed, and the world changed then. It didn't just change. The world changed from then, Mr. President. And here it was that at the end of this regime, when the Common Agricultural Policy was reviewed, Mr. President, the Caribbean region of all the ACP countries was the most uncompetitive, most expensive producer of sugar in the world. Moreover, Mr. Deputy President, the CARICOM region was the only region in the entire ACP that under the duty-free, quota-free access into the EU was not exporting on the world market with the exception of Belize, Mr. President, with the exception of Belize. In contrast, if you're looking at countries like Mauritius, Mauritius was exporting duty-free, quota-free to Europe, and they were exporting duty-free, quota-free into the regional, the neighbors into African countries. But most importantly, they carved out a space for innovation, competition, value added, and they competed on the world market. So when the preferential regime was removed, they were among the most competitive, whereas us in the Caribbean were among the least competitive because we had not transformed our industries, Mr. President. And I call it Stockholm Syndrome because bananas is the same thing, Mr. President. In bananas, we fought for an industry that, yes, produced important jobs, and that mattered. But, Mr. President, in the same way that we argue that for our neighbor to the north, climate change matters. You cannot support a coal industry when technology and the climate change crisis says that we have to go in a different direction. What you do have to say to your workers in the belt of the Midwestern United States is that technology has transformed the way in which this industry does business, and we have to transform with it. And we have to train you and retrain you into new skills for new jobs and new industries. But what we cannot do is to stand still, Mr. President, because the industry has changed. The same applied to sugar, Mr. Deputy President. The same applied to bananas. And in Jamaica, the same applied to bauxite. And here we are in 2019 having a conversation about where to go with our sugar industry. Where are we going to go with every other productive sector, Mr. President? The conversation has changed. And this is a key part of the conversation that has changed, Mr. President. In 2015, the International Trade Center produced a report, and it talks about the changing face of the trading industry of trade. Gone is the notion of goods versus sectors. Gone is the notion of services in terms of temporary movement of persons moving to set up a temporary presence across borders. Where we are now, Mr. President, in that transformed space is value and supply chain integration. That's where the globe has gone. So we're no longer looking at these siloed approaches. We're looking at the integration of goods and services into local markets, regional markets, international markets, and the blending of goods and services to produce final value-added products, Mr. President. Now that brings me back to the CARICOM project, because there's an article that was written by the late Norman Gervan, and many of us who follow Gervan and his writings would be familiar. He wrote this article in 2006, and he wrote it on a concept called production integration, Senator Drakes. And he was talking about production integration and how it is captured within the CARICOM Treaty and the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas 2002. And he said a couple of things. He says what the revised treaty does is to revise the notion of production integration to one that has meaning in the context of open regionalism and market integration. He says that paragraph 7 of the preamble states that the optimal production of economic enterprises in the community requires structured integration of production in the region. In other words, the goal of the CSME is to increase production integration of goods, services, and capital with the world economy. This is the key part that he ends it here. He says, therefore, in other words, production integration, unlike what it was in the initial stages, now refers to the movement of finance, entrepreneurship, management, and labor across the regional space to engage in and to organize production. A key aspect of this will be the formation of regional firms operating into the region as a single economic space for investment and production decisions. We are thinking then of integrated private decision-making and investment and production in the context of an integrated market for goods, services, and the factors of production, and this is what is important, and integrated public policies. Mr. President, this is what the EPA contemplates. The EPA contemplates using the regional platform, regional market, strengthening the CSME, integrating our sectors, and then integrating those into the world economy. This is what the revised treaty, as it talks about production integration, anticipates of us, Mr. President. But if we were to look at the number of firms, let's talk about Barbados first, that have moved outside of Barbados and set up a commercial presence, even in the region, the number is low. You can count the number of firms on one hand. Mr. President, if you were to look at those firms that have integrated into the global economy, you will see that before the EPA was signed in 2008, the same number of firms that were excelling on the global market are the same firms that are excelling post the EPA. So what are we doing, Mr. President? What are our institutional policy and private decision-making approaches to correct this in this new agreement? Mr. President, I'm supportive of the agreement. We have to trade. We have to be integrated, but I'm calling and pleading with all of our stakeholders, especially those in the private sector, to use the agreements to help their businesses to grow and to help our country to grow, Mr. President. We need a couple of key outcomes, and I'm going to spend my last few minutes talking about those outcomes. One, we need a new trade policy, Mr. President. We have an antiquated approach to trade policy making. And so I am firmly of the view, Mr. President, and I have held this view for a very long time, that those persons who are in policy making positions, particularly in our public sector institutions, need to have a rotation in the private sector. People need to understand that the delays in a file on your desk translate into loss of investment. People need to understand that the failure to access funds to get an SPS laboratory so we can export meat and fish to the European Union have an impact on national development, Mr. President. People need to understand that for trade facilitation measures, the failure to approve import licenses or any license, for example, or to make that process cumbersome has an impact on the cost of doing business in this country. And most importantly, Mr. President, because the world of trade is globally integrated and because people have so much to choose from. I remember, Mr. President, in a previous life, when we were at the time negotiating with Canada, I remember having to write a dissenting opinion from some of our colleagues in the public sector at the time who had a very different view that I felt was not grounded in reality. Mr. President, I say that with no pleasure. The notion at the time was we were looming towards a deadline where we had to agree on the provisions of the CARIFORUM Canada agreement. And the question being asked of us was, if we don't sign an agreement by the deadline, what would be the impact? And there was an opinion that came forward which said the status quo would remain as is. And I remember being deeply troubled by that, Mr. President, deeply, deeply troubled. Because there's only one scenario in which that would be true. If the CARIFORUM countries, and at the time Canada, were the only countries in the world. That is the only scenario where that could be the truth. But since we know that that is not the reality, because Canada and all other developing and major trade nations, developed and major trading nations, are signing agreements at the speed of light globally, Mr. President, there was no possibility that the status quo would remain. What we expected, and the paper that I wrote at the time said, what we could expect was trade diversion, as opposed to trade creation. Persons who did not have to trade with the region because there was not the existence of a trade agreement, there was no predictability or transparency, there were no mutual recognition agreements in place that allowed for a degree of homogeneity across the skills and movement of qualifications and recognition and equivalence, people would do business elsewhere. Where those agreements existed, trade would be created there, Mr. President. And so here we are again with another lost opportunity in the EPA with the EU, and on the cusp of a new agreement with the UK. Having the same conversations we had in 2008, having the same conversations we had in 2014, Mr. President, and I'm here to say today that the time has passed for these conversations to be as they are. It is time for a change. So the second thing I wanted to, the third point I think I am now at is a twinning of our approaches, Mr. President. The EPA incorporates it. Production integration in the article I have quoted from Norman Gervan speaks about it being integrated. And it is a twinning of our trade and investment policy, Mr. President. So there is a notion that investment is a very narrow type thing that speaks to new infrastructure or new projects, or in some instances offshoring of projects, which we've just had to obviously change with the IBC legislation. But Mr. President, if you were to read the reports from UNCTAD, UNCTAD has a report on something called Quality for Indirect Investment. And in that report, it talks about attracting investment into your country in your key export-oriented sectors that then help to integrate your country and your domestic production into those global and value supply chains. And if we take the example of the Southeast Asian nations, Mr. President, they are a perfect example of global value chain integration. So you see one part of a production takes place in one country, the second part takes place in another, assembly takes place in a third, and then jointly they export. They could have what we call accumulation of rules of origin, and then they export into the international market, Mr. President. And multiple economies benefit from the production of a single value-added product that integrates research and development as well, and the various services clusters that Senator Holder spoke about as well. That is the way that the international community has gone. We need a new trade policy, and we need a trade policy that twins trade and investment together. Mr. President, I am a fundamental regionalist. I believe with my whole heart in the regional integration project. I believe that we are too small, even though we think some of us are bigger than others. And I'm often reminded of a friend of mine who is South African, and he had an aunt who was married to a Jamaican at the time. The aunt was from Malawi, and she was married to a Jamaican. And when he said, oh, I have my friend, we were in Johannesburg somewhere, and he says, I have my friend, she's from your region, she's from Barbados. And his aunt's husband says, you should call her Smalley. I never remember her name, you should call her Smalley. And I said, what does Smalley mean? He said, because that's what we call them from Jamaica. We call them Smalley because they're small islands. And my friend, who's South African, he said, but how is small? How small is small for you? How many people do you have? How many people do you have? And he started to go through the various islands because he's a professional, well-traveled. And he started to laugh. He laughed until he cried. He said, and you call each other small? The size of your country is the size of my village. So this notion that one country is big enough to go it alone, I'm saying today, Mr. President, is a nonsense. So comparatively, in the region, you may think you're bigger than one or the other, but you cannot go it alone in this global community because you are Smalley in the international community, Mr. President. You are a genuine Smalley. So we have to be able to rationalize not just as small island states, but small and vulnerable economies, language which we use in the World Trade Organization to define our grouping. Small and vulnerable economies, open to external shock, vulnerable to external conditions, price takers as opposed to price creators, and anything that looks like a disaster of any kind can wipe us out completely for a long time, even for generations, Mr. President. So we have to keep using the language of small and vulnerable economies, but it cannot continue to be a crutch, Mr. President, for us not pushing forward with our own development agenda. And this agreement requires us to do just that. Why does it require us to do that, Mr. President? Because unlike most other trade agreements, this includes an entire development cooperation chapter, which has been funded. And what is important about this particular agreement is that the majority of that funding comes from the from the UK. Mr. President, I want to talk just briefly as I close up about that absorptive capacity. Mr. President, over the years, from 2008 until 2014, certainly, and then I'll come to up to 2019, the absorptive capacity for the CARICOM region of the CARIFORUM region has been less than 50%, and I'm being generous in that, Mr. President. In some years, our absorptive capacity for these development cooperation funds has reached no higher than 65%. But when we hit below the 50% mark, what that means, Mr. President, is that woefully needed, critically needed development resources are going back to the funders. We cannot afford that, Mr. President. So we're not writing enough projects. And we had a scenario where in the last 10 years, and I remember this vividly, there were any number of funds that were developed for the purpose of implementation. And there was a deliberate decision made not to make those funds available to the private sector, who actually is meant to lead in these instances. And do you know what happened to those funds, Mr. Deputy President? They went back. They went back. And so here we are lamenting the failure of utilization of some of these resources, but we ourselves shot ourselves in the foot. Now, 3 more points, Mr. President, in terms of outcomes. Our trade policy process needs to be repurposed. In 2008, when we had a change of government, the new administration made a couple of key decisions that contributed to our failure to implement this agreement and to move in a new aggressive trade direction. They starved, if you look at the budget for Invest Barbados was starved of promotion resources for many years, certainly the last 9 years. And there was a new entity that was created to help drive Barbados's trade agenda called Export Barbados. Within weeks, months of coming to office, the previous administration closed Export Barbados and decided to use an entity that existed before that really was not well equipped for that identical purpose to serve as a trade promotion entity. If you look at Export TT, Mr. Deputy President, it's functioning and it's doing well, and it has served Trinidad and Tobago well. And you will see export by country entities all across the Caribbean in different incarnations, Mr. President. However, the decision to close Export Barbados and to not invest the resources in a dedicated export-oriented entity has contributed negatively to our country's development processes. Now, Senator Drakes talked about a 20-year visioning and talked about wanting to have that long-term vision. Mr. Deputy President, I'm supportive of that. In 5-year increments or 10-year increments, it has to be updated because the world that we saw 5 years ago doesn't exist today. So it is impossible for us to implement a 20-year plan that is created in 2019. So it has to be updated. But certainly a 20-year plan is not meant to take you to the next 20 years. It is meant to put you in front of the next 10. It is meant to say to you, in the next 10 years, this is where I need to be in a visionary, future-forward, future-proof format that allows us to transform industry and all of the aspects required for development within it. Mr. President, finally, we need to have a mindset shift. We need to think about the way in which we do business entirely differently. Now, Mr. President, I saw something very recently, and they were talking about the way in which technology was interfacing with business. And they were arguing that it was going to put people out of jobs. Now, Mr. President, we have a choice. We have a choice to keep pace with the rest of the world and achieve the levels of development that we want for ourselves while repurposing, retooling, reskilling our labor force so that they are able to keep pace. But the notion that we must stand still and keep industries as they were 20 years ago, staffed at the levels that they were 20 years ago, with skills as they were 20 years ago, is not going to deliver for us the development objectives that we have set for ourselves, Mr. Deputy President. And so I'm hopeful. I'm looking forward to this particular bill being passed today, Mr. President. It is an extraordinary day because all of us are in agreement with the bill itself. There are no objections to be voiced, Mr. President, but I think that we are all going to be putting our voices, our hands, and our minds towards how we can contribute to its successful implementation, unlike its predecessors, Mr. President. And with those words, I'm obliged to you.
Well, I must say that I have enjoyed Senator McConney's contribution, Senator Drake's contribution, Senator Holder's contribution, and in fact, all the ladies today have been just brilliant, brilliant. Very, very much so. Now let us see if we can continue this. I see the next person is Senator Brad.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President, for your introduction. You know, of course, this is not my bread and butter. Some years ago, I did function as a senior consultant in the Ministry of Industry and International Business. And at that time, I was involved with the restructuring of the manufacturing sector. Involved at that time, I remember, sir, that just around 2000, there would have been the removal of the restrictive licenses that would have been used in relation to trade, and that would have been replaced with bound rates of duty, which were required to be reduced over time. I start there, sir, to say that that was yesterday's regret. What happened, sir, in 2003, I got the opportunity to function in the area of tourism and international transport, and it would be true to say that since those days, I really have not looked back. I have embraced tourism, and tourism has embraced me. But I, however, felt that it was important for me to lend my voice, however briefly, in this debate, and to communicate my support for what I consider, sir, to be a very important bill. Of course, the bill that is before this chamber for consideration essentially seeks to protect trade and seeks to ensure that the interests of CARIFORUM countries, but I'll speak specifically, Mr. Deputy President, Barbados, to ensure that our interest is protected in the one case in relation to the Dominican Republic, and in another case in relation to the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. It provides, as has been stated before, the opportunity for Barbadian businesses to be able to take advantage of setting up companies in the European Union and in the United Kingdom. And there are essentially 2 points that I want to make in this brief presentation that I will give today. And the first, sir, relates to global competitiveness. In fact, sir, as I reflect on the year 2000, I believe that the then Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs and Prime Minister would have indicated in his economic policy statement that it was important, with the removal of the restrictive licensing regime and the introduction of the bound rates, for companies, in particular manufacturing companies, to become globally competitive. And of course, we accept that to become globally competitive, it cannot occur simply by us saying that and by us wishing that we do have to ensure that we are able to institute the measures to facilitate the global competitiveness that is required. And I want, sir, to reflect on a couple of things. I think that it is very important for the small and medium-sized enterprises in particular, and I speak to with reference to the manufacturing entity, to leverage on what I consider to be a global competitive industry existing here in Barbados, and that is tourism. Now, Mr. Deputy President, I'm not going to give a speech on tourism. There are going to be other opportunities for that. But I think that it is important to recognize that through the strengthening of the linkages between tourism and other sectors, that we are able to facilitate the global competitiveness. And let us talk, sir, for example, about condiments. There are a number of companies here in Barbados that I think have the opportunity to properly produce and to supply for the tourism industry. But we have to ensure that there is consistency in terms of quality, consistency in terms of price, consistency in terms of availability. And I would want, sir, as we speak to this bill, to encourage firms, manufacturing firms, to seek to ensure that there's greater collaboration with the tourism industry and to seek to provide products which are of an international standard and which can be globally competitive. Of course, sir, I heard one of our senators, I believe it was Senator Lisa Cummins, speak to the issue of small. And I think that it is important for us not only to look at leveraging the resources that we have here in Barbados, but it is also important for us to leverage the resources that exist in the region as well. You know, sir, I'm reminded that there was an economist by the name of Adam Smith. I believe in 1776, Adam Smith wrote a book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, commonly referred to as the Wealth of Nations. And in that book, Adam Smith spoke about the invisible hand. And in essence, what he was saying was that there is a certain economic self-interest that tends to drive the manner in which firms and businesses and individuals as well operate. In fact, I believe in that book he would have given an example of a baker. And he indicated that in fact, he asked the question, why does the baker go to work every day and bake bread? And he indicated that the reason that the baker did that was not because he had a desire to share or to give his bread to other people. The reason why the baker did that essentially was to be able to sell that bread and to utilize the monies that he received to engage in other activities. And I go to the issue of economic self-interest, because sometimes we tend to focus only on the particular firm and the particular entity without recognizing that there are opportunities where we can leverage and collaborate with other entities within the region to allow us to be better able to position ourselves in markets such as the United Kingdom and the EU. You know, sir, there was a time when a late Prime Minister said, and I thought, sir, it was very unfortunate, that late Prime Minister said, ever so welcome, wait for a call. What that, sir, would have signaled, particularly at the time to Guyanese, was that they were not really welcome in Barbados. And I go to that because I think that we have to recognize, and I want to reiterate the point made by Senator Cummins. We have to realize, sir, that we are not able to function as small independent states, and we are not able to see the full benefits that would come from such economic partnership agreements if we continue to function solely as small entities. We do have to collaborate. We do have to seek, sir, to ensure that we work with each other. Sir, you know, I remember to the words of a well-known Barbadian entertainer, Lil Rick. Lil Rick has a song called Do For Do. And I won't go through the song, sir. I wouldn't even attempt to sing the song. But in that song, he says something like this. If you want some of my plantain, give me some of your berry fruit. If you gonna use my dumpling, let me put my spoon in your soup. And essentially, what he is saying is that through better collaboration and through better cooperation, I'm not hearing the side, sir. Through better collaboration and better cooperation, what we are all able to do is to be better able to achieve the objectives that we have and that everyone is happy. So that my message, sir, is that there needs to be a greater level of collaboration at the regional level so that entities can continue to ensure, yes, that they achieve their specific goal and objective, but at the same time, that collaboration also leads to greater benefits as well. So I want to spend just a few minutes, because I did indicate that it would be very brief in my contribution. And that's only 5 minutes so far, and 5 more minutes now. I do want to speak, sir, to the issue of productivity and cost. I think, sir, that it is very important that all of us, all Barbadians, recognize that we do have to give of our best every single day. In fact, the Prime Minister, in her address at Kensington Oval for Independence Day, made specific reference to productivity. And I think, sir, that productivity is a subject that we must pay some attention to. I may have said in this chamber before, I recall functioning as a senior consultant in industry and international business. There was a manufacturing entity that came to the ministry with a concern. That entity engaged workers who were required for, and I may not have the precise time, but what I will relate to you will give you what I'm trying really to, the message I'm trying really to get across. What would have happened is that this firm would have had individuals who sat down and for 15 minutes they looked at bottles on the production line. And then for the next 45 minutes they were doing absolutely nothing. And the company sought to engage with the workers' representative at that time to ensure that those workers were able to do something else. Of course, the workers' representative had indicated that it was a change in the job description at the time, and I accept, sir, that it was. No difficulty there at all. What subsequently happened, though, is that the company closed. The truth is, and the reality was this, that there is no way that the company could continue to have individuals essentially working for 15 minutes out of 1 hour. That really is not required and really could not be sustainable. I therefore, sir, wish to suggest that there does need in Barbados to be a fundamental change in the manner in which we do business. But that change requires that there's a mature and responsible approach by all of the entities involved, essentially the government, the private sector, and the trade unions. I think that is critical. And of course, as it relates to management, let me say this. I think that managers have to lead by example, and they have a responsibility to ensure that they create value within the organization. Sir, you know, I think too that we have to ensure, as we speak about productivity, that we embrace new methodologies. Only yesterday at a workshop which the BHDA hosted with Sagicor and CGM Gallagher, I spoke to the issue of flexible schedules and working from at home. And as I say that, sir, you know, there's certain times, sir, that I don't travel on the road. The reason for that is that I do not wish to be caught up in the traffic. Sometimes you can spend hours on the road, and it is very, very frustrating. It is very, very unproductive. And we do have to, as persons operating in the private sector and in government, to look at the introduction of flexible schedules and to look where possible to allow individuals to be able to work from home. I think, sir, that in the firm as well, you know, in the past there has at times been the emphasis on purchasing equipment and the utilization of technology, looking specifically at price. But I want to suggest that there needs consistently to be a focus on purchasing quality as opposed to paying attention essentially on price. I do know, sir, that there are some manufacturing entities that have not fully utilized and exploited the technology that they have bought. And it is important in today's environment, because the reality is this, and I've said this to this chamber before, nobody owes us anything. And sir, we have not done a good job in communicating to Barbadians the importance for them to give a full day's work for a full day's pay. Sir, you know, in the early 1990s when I returned from university, there was a friend, she returned as well with me, and she went to work in government. And I'm giving this example, this is in government, but this example could be applicable to the private sector as well. And she told me, "Ma, Rudy, I'm pushing some work. And a senior officer pulled her aside and asked her, "What are you doing? Do you want to embarrass us? You doing how much work? Slow down." I'm saying, sir, in this chamber, and I'm saying to Barbadians, that the time has come when we must ensure that every single day when we go to work, that we give honestly of our time, because the manner in which we produce at the end of the day impacts and affects all of us. This is a time when every single Barbadian must ensure that we hold hands with each other. They must no longer, sir, be those who seek to cheat the system. And if you are unable to give what is required of you, then, sir, you should do the responsible thing and move away from the task to which you are assigned. So, sir, today I'm extremely happy to be able to support this bill. I think this bill is very important. I think it's a bill that continues to signal the opportunities that exist for Barbadians. But let us understand that while this glass of water that Senator Holder has is now cool, this glass of water has the potential of becoming hot. But sir, moving from the potentiality of being cold to the actuality of being hot requires a number of actions. And therefore, to fully exploit and to take advantage of the opportunities that exist with the EPAN under this bill, I am calling on all Barbadian firms and all Barbadians to take the necessary action so that together we can continue to go forward and to advance. With those few words, sir, I am obliged.
Mr. Deputy President, I am warm after that presentation. And I have to thank all of our honorables, the honorable members of this House who have made a contribution to this bill, and I'm grateful to see that they're all in support of this bill. Senator Holder, Senator Drakes brought to our attention the concept of the product space, where there's connectivity that enables us to transfer materials and to make strategic shifts in production in order to remain competitive. and she talked about the need for us to make this agreement, this EPA, to become real to people on the ground. Senator Holder made it clear that we needed to continue to see agreements such as these and others from a business perspective, and she referred to a report that sought to do so. And she said, you know, we need to learn from the lessons of the past and be able to move forward, carrying forward the benefits of those lessons. And she was specific. She didn't just say so in general terms. She talked about the fact that there was a seriousness with regards to the EPA implementation unit, the Economic Partnership Agreement implementation unit, which was closed by a former administration. She talked about funds from the Inter-American Development Bank that were there for the taking, and Barbados forfeited the right to use those funds because we either didn't pay attention or we made some deliberate decisions not to access them. And she made it clear that this agreement would make no sense unless we take seriously the building of capacity of the small, medium enterprises. And in fact, she made such an impassioned call for the EPA implementation unit to be reinstituted or at least established. I imagine that she might even be interested in heading it. Senator Cummins, I imagine, Senator Cummins spoke of value chain integration, where we can collaborate as economies to become more globally competitive. And she gave some very specific examples of countries that are doing so successfully. She talked about Barbados, where some of the key entities that are to help our export thrust were either starved of resources or again closed with a lack of vision for what has to happen in the future. Senator Grant spoke of global competitiveness and about being able to pursue relationships that can help that competitiveness through mutual benefit, a la Lil Rick. And he spoke about productivity. And so, Mr. Deputy President, this has been a rich discussion. I think it has been entirely beneficial. And I now wish to say that should this bill now pass, which I believe it should, given the discussions, that it will come into effect when the ink has settled on the divorce between the UK and the European Union. With these few words, Mr. Deputy President, I beg to move that this bill again be read a second time.
Question is that the bill be read a second time. Honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Deputy President, I beg to move that your honor do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself in committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do now leave the chair and the Senate convene itself into committee for further consideration of this bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The House is now in committee.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 stand part. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 2 stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 stand part. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. All those senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 3.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 3 stand part.
The question is that Clause 3 stand part. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. All those senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 4.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 4 stand part.
The question is that Clause 4 stand part. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 5.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 5 stand part.
The question is that Clause 5 stand part. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the schedule be the schedule to the bill.
The question is that the schedule be the schedule to the bill. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those members against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honor the Deputy President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those members against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee.
Mr. Deputy President, I beg to move that this bill be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Economic Partnership Agreement between the Caribbean Community, the Dominican Republic, and United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Act 2019.
The question is that the bill be passed and be cited as the Economic Partnership Agreement between the Caribbean Community, the Dominican Republic, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland Bill 2019. Act. All honorable members in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. The bill has been passed and will be so cited.
The Deputy President, order number 2. Order number 2, in the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, Acting Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Award of Pride of Barbados Bill 2019.
Mr. Deputy President, I rise to introduce the Award of Pride of Barbados Bill 2019. This award, Mr. Deputy President, was created to be awarded initially during the Vision 2020 regathering, which starts January of 2020, and thereafter on National Heroes Day. This bill, a simple bill to introduce this award, enables the Governor General to exercise her authority to confer this award on the advice of the Prime Minister. It is anticipated that there will be not more than 20 awards each month of the year 2020 in the first instance, with 10 persons residing in Barbados and 10 persons who reside outside of Barbados in the diaspora. Who would be eligible for these Pride of Barbados Awards, Mr. Deputy President? Any citizen of Barbados or person entitled to be a registered citizen of Barbados or a permanent resident of Barbados. It is intended that such an award for the Pride of Barbados would go to those who, through sacrifice, through diligence, through dedication to service, have made an outstanding contribution to community life, to the improvement of economic and social conditions in the particular parish in Barbados. This award anticipates that those who would nominate would be Barbadians who are either living in the respective parish, the parish peers, or former residents of the parish who are now living overseas. We believe that the people in the parish would be best placed to be able to make those nominations of those who have made a contribution in that parish. It is intended, Mr. Deputy President, that people will be recognized by virtue of their humanitarian, social, religious, or educational contribution to the development of the community. Community building is serious. Sir, I could not come to the end of the introduction of this bill without talking about regathering, which is the opportunity for Barbadians and those who love Barbados to come home and contribute to the rebuilding and the development of Barbados, parish by parish by parish. It is a homecoming that we anticipate will reunite friends and family and connect us again as a Barbados, a whole Barbados, to the values that have made us who and what we are. It is anticipated, Mr. Deputy President, and this was part of the vision of our Prime Minister, that starting January, we will start to invite those persons back home who wish to be a part of helping us grow from strength to strength. And if I may, Mr. President, Mr. Deputy President, is to let you know how, in an ordered way, we are seeking to bring the gathering back to Barbados. In January, the parish of St. Lucie, and their theme will be faith. Every single parish has identified a theme that will then drive the kinds of events that will be facilitated in their communities. In February, St. Peter, their theme is heritage. St. Thomas is in March, nature. St. Joseph is in April. The theme for St. Joseph is adventure. St. John is in May. The theme is community. St. George is in June. The theme is land. St. Philip, sir, which I know, Deputy President, is dear to your heart and dear to mine too. is in July, which is sugar. St. Andrew is a sweet. Sweet. St. Philip just sweet. All of Barbados is sweet. St. Andrew is in August. The arts is their theme. St. James is in September. Cricket. Christ Church is in October. The sea is the theme. St. Michael is in November. It is fetting and food. And then nationwide, we bring everyone home in December for a friends and family celebration. It is intended that we gathering, Mr. Deputy President, will be about fellowship. It will be about food. It will be about community events. There will even be an opportunity for Barbadians to trace their roots and their heritage at our genealogy marketplace. There'll be major events, all types of events, festivals, sporting, entertainment. They will be held across Barbados, and talented Barbadians, cultural and creative practitioners will showcase their goods in pride to their parish. Bajan philanthropy will also be an important part of it. It is an opportunity for us to engage Barbadians in giving back to causes in Barbados that are meaningful to us and that indeed will enable us to be able to fill some of the resource gaps we have and be able to move ourselves to the next level. This is just the beginning for us, Mr. President. For those in this honorable house who are of the theological persuasion or bent, they would know Mark 6:4 said, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house." This is a bill, Mr. Deputy President, that seeks to ensure that that cannot be said of Barbadians. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Sir, I will be brief, much briefer than Senator Holder has been in her brief sessions. But, sir, I couldn't let this opportunity pass without saying something about this bill. I think it's a good first start. I think it's a good first start, sir.
First start.
I have always complained
We know.
that people in Barbados who really deserve honor don't get it. We have community practitioners, probably if they calling them these days, who go out, they spend their own money to do everything. And the only thing they get at the end of the time is a big funeral because everybody loves them, everybody turn out. They are not recognized during their lifetime. I am happy that the government has decided to at least address that aspect of it. Let me tell you something, and I have had people that I've interacted with who I would prefer to see the highest national honor for the service that they have given to us. One person in particular, Lieutenant Colonel Dayton Maynard, who was one of the people I look up to. There are very few people like that, trust me. But he is one of the few people that I really look up to in this world. He has been an inspiration to generations of Commonwealthians. I remember when I went to school, he was responsible for the cadets, he was responsible for the scouts, and he was the hockey coach, and he taught me English as well. I can see him now, you know, as an example for every student in Commonwealth to follow. You know, you couldn't, you know, we used to try to fight to catch him in something, you know, to make him like one of us. Because he was almost, we always wanted to find him out to catch him. We never could. He lived his life in such a way that I'm not saying that he's an angel. I'm saying that we don't have any evidence that he isn't. Because of the example that he has set. And I don't know of any honors that have been given to him, national or otherwise, but some person who truly deserves it. Let me do something. I remember a friend of mine, he was misbehaving at school. And he went on to the headmaster, and the headmaster said to him, if you don't behave yourself, I'm going to let Mr. Meredith know. That was enough for him to behave, because he didn't want Mr. Meredith to know that you misbehaved in any way, you know what I mean? And this is the headmaster that was saying it. So that is the kind of people, and we have people like that, well, not of his caliber, but other people who deserve some sort of recognition, and they don't get it. I would want to see, that's why I said this is a good first step. I would want to see people who are given this award to have something other than the badge or the emblem or whatever, more tangible, I'm not a piece of change. Something of that, something to show the appreciation of a grateful parish, a grateful country for the sacrifice that they have made. We have teachers in this country who go out of their way. I remember I went to lessons I was at primary school. My mother never paid a cent, because in those days the teachers didn't ask for a cent. And I remember my class 3 teacher, Mr. Brathwaite, he gave lessons. Miss Gibson, Pat Gibson, who was one of my neighbors and teacher, they gave lessons. They made sure that we had all the instructions that we needed, even if they had to put in overtime. They didn't ask for a cent. That's not the case now. But people like them go into retirement and nobody remembers them for the good work that they have done. I really feel, that there should be some way that people like these should be recognized. And I said this bill is a good first effort, but we need to do more. And to tell you something, it might encourage others to get involved in community work, because when you realize that you are being recognized for, a fellow might go the extra mile. We have people like Senator Holder. She's involved in the credit union movement and other things. A lot of people don't know that. And she has given yeoman service. And one of these days, I would like to see her recognized for the work that she's done in the credit union movement. But we don't know this, because people like her and the others that I've spoken about, they don't jump up, they don't keep a noise, they do it quietly and give this sacrifice to the detriment of themselves, their families, or whatever else, and they make a great sacrifice. Coming out of this, sir, as I said, the good first start, we need now to improve on it. A guy who has this thing should get a diplomatic passport or an official passport, something. I'm very serious. He gets that's not a diplomatic passport. He gets an official passport to show that he's one of our people in Barbados who are honored in this country. I don't want statues, but I want something given tangible, that these people could be recognized for the work that they have done. And as I said, I compliment the government on coming up with this idea. This is something that I've spoken about all over the years, and I'm happy that the Prime Minister has actually put something in place now to get it going, and I compliment her on it. Sir, but those very few words, and there were few, sir, I'm much obliged to you.
Thank you, Deputy President. After that very surprising presentation, I don't even know how to begin mine. The bill before us presents a a framework within which we can celebrate those who are involved in strengthening our communities, those who often go unnoticed, and when the reference is being made to them, may be lumped into a category called unsung heroes. It is true that a number of these contributors would say, as we normally do in Barbados, don't mention it. But in Barbados, don't mention it sometimes mean you better pay some attention to what I'm doing. But in a lot of cases, people within our communities do things and they really mean don't mention it. They do it for love of community, for love of the neighborhoods within which they live. They do it often for love of country. It is obvious that the intent of the bill before us is to provide an opportunity for communities to identify some of these people. And it says, for the virtue of their humanitarian, social, religious, or educational contribution to the development of each parish in Barbados and for related matters. It is my view, Deputy President, that underlying this bill is the fact that these individuals are not looking for personal gain, but we are striving to give recognition or maybe influence others, as Senator Franklin was saying, influence others to recognize the importance of making our communities better. So some of these individuals might be very surprised to even understand that their efforts are recognized by people living in the same parish or people living in the same district. They may be surprised that there are people who hold them in such high esteem. But if we look beyond the awardee for just a moment, we should be able to see the wider benefit of the bill before us for building something in Barbados that I think we so desperately need. Community spirit. Something that we so desperately need at a time such as this, especially where to get from where we are to where we aspire to be is such a struggle, it would seem. And we have seen in our history, throughout our history, how communities working together, people working together, the principle upon which movements like the trade union movement and the credit union movement is built, unity, that spirit of coming together, is what is needed more so now to get us to where we desire to be. So if we move beyond the awardees, the potential awardees, I was saying 120, but in the presentation from the acting leader of government businesses, possibly up to 240. So because you're saying 10 per month for each parish. Up to 20 for each parish. So enough people being awarded. But if we move beyond the awardees, we should see the potential it holds for inspiring others to follow in the footsteps of those who are being recognized, inspiring them to have a community mindset. It also allows for communities to become knowledgeable of what people within their communities are doing. Because someone will be nominated by some person who knows what they're doing, but other people in that parish may not necessarily know, and it gives the opportunity for whatever initiative, whatever involvement, for that involvement to grow as well. It encourages communities to take note of the people who walk among them and who are making a difference. But Deputy President, beyond this, I want to zero in on the fact that there are numerous studies being done now that show that happiness of a people is intertwined with the well-being of communities. So if the communities within which you reside are downtrodden, then the people tend to take on the complexion of the communities. So I look beyond those receiving the award to see the fundamentals that underlie the bill before us. Being connected in our communities help us to have a sense of belonging. And that's a sense that so many people need, especially in times where you might not be working, you can't get a job, things not going your way, but to feel a part of a community that values you and to be a part of a community that values community spirit is something that I think that this bill is recognizing. Many of us will hear stories of back in the day when people will say that people of that time knew what it was to be neighbors. They looked out for each other. But we are living in a time where we have become so much more individualistic, and that spirit that seemed to keep communities together is missing. When I first read on this bill, when I first read through it, I thought about a community in the parish, one of the parishes within which I reside, and I thought about the Pride of Wilson Hill group. This is a community that just came together to develop a park, and then it grew beyond that. They would eat together, socialize together, sing together in a community group at a time where you didn't have a word of pride stirring, but people understood the importance of relying on each other. And that's in good times and in bad. So there's no denying that strong neighborhoods will have a positive impact on the quality of life which we experience. Deputy President, I don't believe that the award of pride in itself will be a solution to building community spirit, because I'm very conscious that communities and people must not only be inspired by the what's in it for me, whether I get an award, whether I get a passport, whether I get some money, but we must get back to a place where across our communities we welcome simply the opportunity to give back, to do something for somebody else. Because in doing something for somebody else, it makes us feel better about ourselves. And not that I am negating in any way what Senator Franklin said when he spoke about the passport, because I thought that beyond a badge, what is it that will not speak necessarily to the awardee, but what is it that will incentivize others to see the value in giving a bit more of themselves to the space in which they live? Deputy President, is an important aspect of engaging our citizenry as well in the role that they can play, however small, in developing this country of ours. I think one of the aspects I like most about what I've read in the bill before us is the fact that the nominations for award comes from people who reside within the parish. So nominations about people in a parish made by those who reside in the parish. So in a sense, it takes away the political undercurrents as well that we normally hear. There's a perception that it's only a certain set of people will get independence honors, and there's only a particular way that you will get these things. But what this does is bring communities, the parishes, not constituencies, the parishes involved in selecting people for awards. Deputy President, it is my belief that the bill proposed before this honorable chamber is timely. As I said, when we consider the socio-economic factors that have us buckling our belts. A time when it is not uncommon to hear people complaining, perhaps justifiably so. Maybe I should remove the perhaps and say justifiably so of all the ills around us. Garbage, water, lack of transparency, unemployment, and the list goes on. People often perceive a different world when they look beyond the places within which they live. So although all these things are going on in the country, you'll still find, you can still go into communities, or if you hear about maybe a murder or something going on in a community, it is not uncommon to hear people in the community saying, that's somebody that come in. I don't know what they're doing that to here. This place is not like that, because there's still that sense of people valuing the space within which they live. So what I'm saying is that a more positive narrative is needed in our country right now to facilitate our development. I think that the media has a tremendous role to play in it. But I see this whole gesture of nominating people and recognizing people for the efforts within which, the efforts that they're making within communities as a good step, a positive step in bringing some balance, highlighting not only the ills around us, but also the good that resides within our people and within our communities. Community focus and these community focus awards allow us to look below the surface, therefore, where we can find a country comprised of people in different parishes who are continuing to sow seeds of pride, a pride that binds our hearts from coast to coast, the pride of nationhood. So with these words, I support the bill before us.
Senator Springer.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. I do want to lend my voice in support of this bill. And at the onset, I want to say I like this bill. I like this bill because, as said by Senator Moore, this bill gives us the opportunity to recognize those persons within our society who embodies the values that have shaped this country for the best. This bill allows us to identify those persons who would otherwise go unknown. Mr. President, I believe a country that does not hold these values that we refer to sacred is void and empty. And Barbados, though not being a rich country by any stretch of the imagination, has somehow considered itself rich, maybe not with natural resources, but rich with people who have carried the values of our forefathers and have imparted those values from generation to generation. And I think this bill captures those persons. And I want to identify the reasons why I think it's important to honor persons within communities who have been selfless in their efforts to improve the lives of persons around them. And I've identified about 5 areas here, which I believe one was touched on by both Senator Franklin and Senator Moore. And that the honoring of these persons, in many cases, inspires younger people within the community to follow in their footsteps. On Saturday when I left the parade, I went into Orange Hill and I caught the tail end of an event, a bazaar it was, but at the time they were honoring a teacher, a lady named Springer, who taught me when I was in primary school. Taught me when I was in class 1. I remember her very well. She was very strict. Gave us a lot of licks. But I remember she taught us how to use knife and fork. And I thought that was a common thing throughout primary schools, that you had to learn to eat with knife and fork. I only discovered many years later that it was just her. Apparently that was one of the things that she felt was important for young people to learn. And she took it upon herself to teach us to eat with knife and fork. And I was invited on the stage. I was just passing through, really. But I was invited onto the podium to make a few remarks. And I mentioned that And everybody, I saw persons who could be 50, almost 60 years old. And they say, yes, she taught us too. So there's a whole generation of persons within my community who would have benefited from the teachings of this lady, Miss Springer, in Orange Hill, in the Orange Hill area. Almost every person between the age, I don't know how long ago she retired, but I know persons between the age of 50 and perhaps maybe 30 would have benefited from her. So persons like that, those are the type of persons you need to honor these persons before they pass on. Fortunately, enough for her or the community saw it fit to celebrate her before she dies. Because she has to be in her 80s, or very close, if not past. But the community saw it fit to celebrate her. But I think it's past time that the country, as a whole, the country, Barbados, see it fit to celebrate people like that all across this nation. I'm going to identify some persons because there are persons, I was talking to Senator Franklin a little earlier about persons within our communities that, I mean, they work in areas that maybe those jobs don't exist anymore, but they did those jobs to improve the social standing of everyone involved, all Barbadians. I refer to the well diggers. No, nowadays people dig a well, they use a jackhammer, or sometimes they may call in one of those big construction firms and they will come and drill the well in 1 or 2 days using a big machine. But I remember as a small child, there were persons who would walk around the community with a drill and dynamite. Yes, and those persons were the persons who dug your wells, and that was an extremely dangerous field of work. I've seen it once. We were talking about it, myself and Senator Franklin, how they would dig the well, they would dig the hole, they would place the dynamite in the hole, and they would have to scramble out of the well. Sometimes the well is 10 feet, maybe 15 feet deep. They had to scramble out of the well before the dynamite exploded. Or that was the end of them. And I've seen that. I'm sure over the years that persons would have lost their lives digging wells in Barbados so that people can have sanitary conditions. And these are the type of persons that we forget about, and they're old people now. I don't believe there are any young persons in Barbados walking around who would have dug a well with a drill and dynamite. They have to be old people, 60 years up. And these are the people that we forget about. And even though that job might not have been a prestigious job, but it was important. It was important in our communities because we could, I mean, I was writing my comprehension exam, so you can imagine that's like 30 years ago. I never saw a jackhammer at the time. And many persons live in villages like Orange Hill, where I'm from, would have never seen or would have had the option of a jackhammer. You had to use a well digger. But these persons walked the length and breadth of Barbados, making life comfortable as we were forging our way and heading towards the 21st century facilities. We depended on these people. And now these people have been forgotten. These persons have been forgotten. And we have to celebrate people like that. We have to celebrate those persons in the community who are responsible. I mean, as I said, I don't want to focus on teachers and lessons and so on and so forth. But there are persons who, through sporting activities, engage a lot of young people through sport and kept a lot of people attached who would have otherwise gotten involved in all forms of crime and deviance. But because they were involved in some club or something, these persons sacrificed their time that could have been spent with their family to ensure that these young people were engaged, that they learned skills, they honed their skills. They taught them things. These are people that we celebrate. We should be celebrating. These are the type of people that we should be celebrating. And I'm glad that the criteria does not look at academic achievement. I was looking at someone's name this morning in this honorable place, about 9 letters behind the name, and that's wonderful. Caswell. Wonderful. But there are persons who would have been educated but would have made contributions, or given human service to their community, that help build their community, that help educate the persons or put persons in the position that they could educate themselves and build out their communities, build out their families, and build Barbados as by extension. And those persons, you have to celebrate those persons. And I want to go way, 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 way back. Because there's another group of persons who have long been forgotten. And I would have spoken in here last week about persons coming here, working on plantations and having to self-medicate because there was no health care system in place. But they were healers. On every plantation, there were healers, persons who were blessed or who were skilled in the art of healing. Because, mind you, when persons came here, even though they might have looked healthy, they weren't always healthy. They suffered from maladies. And then there was the added insult of being of the sicknesses that they caught from the nasty plantation owners who could not keep their hands off of them. So there was that too. But they had to treat themselves because there was nobody there to treat them. So we had these healers who would have learned the arts, maybe back home in Africa or maybe on the plantation. And through the centuries, even into the 19th century, these persons were revered within communities, especially in rural communities like where I'm from. There were always healers, persons who we can go to that would knock up something for you, that could treat you. You know, I remember hearing about Wonder World, but that's just the tail end of it. But there were other concoctions that you could get, poultices and other things that you can rub that they can direct you to any plant in the gully or growing around your house that they can make a tea for you that could heal you. You know the thing, right? And these persons now, some of whom have passed on, some of whom are around but who are very, very, very old. These persons were never celebrated, they were never given the credit for the hard work that they have done over the years to ensure that our people within our communities remain healthy. There are people living in villages who have never been to a real doctor or a doctor. They've never been. And now growing up, probably in their old age, they started going to the doctor, but growing up, they've never been to a doctor. They go with somebody in the village or some old lady in the village, and that person would make something, give them something to drink, and they were better. I remember I was in Ghana in 2013, and I had a bad cold. And the lady gave me something to drink. I can't tell you what it was. I cannot tell you what it was. Yes, but actually it was down there researching. I was in Ghana researching medicinal plant remedies. I was interviewing the lady, and she heard the cough. And she said, hey, I have something here for you. Work. Like, yes, it worked. Worked like a dream. So I'm giving testimony to the fact that these things work. Yes, perhaps. It tasted something like, but please, tasted awful, but it worked. But these persons but that's why I think at some point we have to look at awarding, conferring awards on persons, posthumously who have died, who have passed on, because they would have made tremendous contributions during their time, and we are all better because of their contributions. Yes. You can't even forget that person who, within the village, who would have assisted in the birth of countless Barbadians right at home in St. Andrew. If you live in St. Andrew, you couldn't get to Queen Elizabeth Hospital. You couldn't. Yeah. I mean, at one point in time, there was no hospital. You understand? But these midwives in the village, they were responsible for assisting women in giving birth. And a lot of us born at home, I think I was born at home. I believe so. And of course, those of you who of no older vintage definitely were born at home. So, right? So it's important that we recognize this person. And there's another group of people, a small group of persons who have contributed in a way that I think they don't get the credit that they deserve. You see, an undertaker? I gotta mention it though. I have to mention it. Because I remember some years ago I spoke to Undertaker, right? And he said this to me. I remember it, and it could have been about 15 years ago. He said this: you know how many people in Barbados I buried that didn't pay me? Entire families turned to these people. The father died a few years ago. I never got paid for him. But then the mother dies. You can't turn them away. They don't turn you away. They still bury the relative. You still owing them money. Third relative in the house, sometimes a fourth, and they're still owing these people money. But they allow you to bury your family with dignity. But yet, you mentioned undertaker in this country, there's a hush. But no, these people made a contribution too. Added to the type of life that we enjoy here too. You understand? So you have to recognize those people too. Don't dismiss them. They've made a contribution. And I realize that today people are focusing on short presentations as opposed to long. I've seen for the first time my colleague here. Yeah, 17 minutes. I was timing him. Yes. All right. So I'm not going to delay this house too much, but there's something I need to mention. Now I know I mentioned persons that would have passed. Last month, I think it was, I visited a church in my community. Church was celebrating 90 years of existence. And I thought to myself back in 1929 that persons living in that Orange Hill community who felt it important to start this church. I tried to throw my mind back to what was going on in 1929 in Barbados. Nothing much. I mean, the world was going through economic crisis, that was for sure. I'm sure it was 1927 or so where we had the Dust Bowl. That was what it was called? 1927 or so. It was going through crisis. We had just come out of the First World War. We were just a few years away from the Second World War. We had the Great Depression. Great Depression was what the world was struggling. And I used to imagine things in Barbados were just as depressing. I mean, 8 years before the riots, it had to have been depressing. In the 1920s, in the 1930s, it was depressing. So imagine how it couldn't have been any better in the 1920s and just a few years coming out of slavery. It was awful. But these persons within my community, they felt that Orange Hill and the surrounding areas needed a spiritual fix. Spiritual fix. I perhaps was thinking that there might have been important in their views that the founding of that church would mean that 79 years later, this country will find itself being governed by an administration so inept, so uncaring, that we may need a church in every society more than ever. But that was my thing. But I believe that in those 90 years ago, that people saw it fit to bring within the community something that was needed, something that helped, was the glue that kept that community together for 90 years. That kept that community grounded for 90 years, spiritually grounded. And gave persons refuge in hard times. And no one has to tell me, don't have to read in any text that in 1929 things were hard. Things had to have been hard. Things are hard now, and things were worse then. Worse. We were still living in the shadow of the plantation. We were still living under the harsh of colonialism. Things were awful. We didn't enjoy any rights. We couldn't vote. Very little we could do. We had no money. We weren't paid anything much. Things weren't good. So persons who felt that perhaps the only respite that a person might have had was in the house of the Lord and saw it fit to set up a church. Those type of persons have to be recognized. Even long after they have passed, you have to recognize people like that. And that church is still there in Orange Hill, 90 years later, serving the good people of Orange Hill. How can you not recognize someone who have done something like that with that type of longevity? And the persons that came afterwards that sustained that church. People like that we have to recognize, we have to pull out, you have to mention them, even though they are gone, we have to mention them. I think this bill provides the platform, the opportunity that people like that could be recognized. The people that go unnoticed, as the good senator over there said, the ones who are lumped into the group of unsung heroes. Unsung heroes. And I think this bill, what it will do, now I've seen evidence of it in places like Belplain and in St. Andrew, where they already celebrate their community heroes. If you go into Belplain now, when you pass by the A. Costa Edwards Primary School, you will see a mural. I think it has pillars of our society or something like that, where you see all the heroes, all the community heroes of all walks of life. Big fancy. I mean, they don't even, not even politicians on there. I don't even think Emery Bourne is on there, even though she was a hero in her own right. But all walks of persons, all the midwives, all the police, all the persons who would have done little things in the community that would help people, you know, who engaged the community, who were very community-minded. Those persons are represented on that mural. And that's what we have to do. We have to bring back that whole culture of celebrating our own. I was glad that I was there to see Ms. Springer being celebrated. But how many persons who have given their life to the community, who have died and gone long, have never been recognized. Never been recognized. We cannot continue like that going forward. And I think this bill puts us in a position that we can address and we can right that particular wrong. Mr. Deputy President, there's lots that I can say on this particular bill. But in the spirit of today's proceedings, Mr. President, I'm going to shorten my presentation and reiterate my support for this bill. I want to fully associate myself with the words of the senator on that side, Senator Moore, I'm sorry, and my colleague over on the opposite side, because I believe that we all are united in our view that persons within this space, within Barbados, should be celebrated, and persons of all walks of life should at some point in their life, before they go up, enjoy the benefit of being recognized nationally for what they did for their community, albeit selflessly for their community. And with those few words, Mr. Deputy President, I'm obliged.
Thank you, Senator Springer. I recognize Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President.
Chris.
I recognize that a particular tone has been set in this debate for short speeches, and I assure you that I shall not deviate from that trend. I just want to say, Mr. Deputy President, that I rise in support of this bill. I think it is timely. God knows we need as many good role models as we can identify, particularly in this present times that we are in. It seems to be these days a world of anger, lack of respect, impatience by everyone. We settle our arguments by the gun and so on. And we really need every role model that we can find to try to reverse the trend that has, to some extent, overtaken a lot of our communities. And so I think this is one step that I hope will lead in a direction that will help to bring more positive images and aspects to our various communities. As I was sitting here, I recall perhaps just a few months ago reading an article in the Nation, for example, of a lady. I believe they call them crossing guards or school attendants or so. But these people who help the school children across the road. Now, normally you probably say, well, this is not really a big thing. But when I read that article in The Nation, what struck me that this was an individual, and I think she was assigned to the Belmont School or one of those schools in that area. She knew all the children by their names. She knew their relatives. She knew who came to pick them up from school each evening. If they were late, she would hold on to them and keep them and make sure that they didn't get into any kind of mischief. And it just struck me that these are the type of unsung heroes that we really need to recognize, because they are integral to developing the type of communities which I certainly knew of, and which I'm sure, Mr. Deputy President, you knew of back in your days when children, like when we were children, we were not only raised by our parents, but everybody in the community. And they stepped in and they made sure that if they saw something going wrong, in some cases they applied whatever discipline they could themselves, or if they felt it was beyond them, they made sure that they made your parents aware of something that they needed to pay serious attention to in that particular child. And therefore, we had the concept, and we've heard it before, it's not a cliche, but we've heard it before, the concept of the community raising our children. And I think we need desperately to get back to that stage. And so it is my hope that these awards and the awardees can form some sort of pattern for imitation by others, particularly the youth in the communities. Mr. President, I accept that the communities of yesteryear have changed quite a bit. I just spoke about we baby boomers and the type of communities that we came up in. But of course, we have new cultures. We have the new block cultures. We have all types of different characters who have been able to have a tremendous influence on the young children and the young youth in the various communities. And I trust that and these new cultures, these new leaders in those communities have been able to demand, in some cases, a tremendous amount of loyalty from the youth through coercing them with financial rewards, other aspects. And we have got somehow to make sure that we start to reverse that trend. And therefore, to recognize that there are still some positives in our communities, and to acknowledge them publicly, I think, could help to reverse that trend. Mr. Deputy President, the bill speaks to outstanding contributions to community life or to improve economic or social conditions. And it says areas that to be considered. I would suggest we make sure that we look at things like art and culture, that we look at things like the environment, again, a big issue in this day and age. Prime Minister spoke to the issue at the Independence Day celebrations. And so I think that we need to recognize people who have been making and trying their effort best to improve our environment through various projects and so on. But also not to be left out, of course, is heritage. And I would like to think that when we think about the awardees, that we make sure that all of those areas are covered. Just one other little thing I wasn't so sure of is in the bill. I'm not so sure if we talked about 2020 and regathering. And I was just beginning to wonder, is this only for the year 2020? Fine. I just wanted to be clear on that because this has to be something that we make sure is perpetuated. The other thing I wanted to ask, as well as it says persons, in the usual definition of persons, it can mean some other things other than individuals. And the only way is that because I think there are a number of groups, community groups as well, other than individuals who have played significant roles in their communities. And therefore, I think groups as well should be entitled to be nominated for awards. I mean, I'm not advocating or I'm not particularly trying to suggest any particular groups, but I certainly, it immediately comes to mind groups like the Pinelands Creative Workshop, who has done yeoman service for the youth in that area, the Israel Lovell Foundation over in the Ivy area, again, that has done tremendous amount of work in trying to raise positive values in our youth. And so I think that groups like those certainly should be entitled as well to be nominated for the awards. The only other thing I would wish to say is that I thought that the number of 240 per year seems quite a bit. And
Maximum.
10. Well, you have 10 per month, 20 per month. So in a year, you can have as much as 240 awards. And I'm saying if this continues, you have to be careful that you don't end up with an award that becomes so watered down, it's so largely distributed that it loses value. And I think that is something we could probably look at and see how we can tweak it so that we continue to maintain what I think is an extremely positive award. And the final thing is that I just want to comment on, and as I said, as I was saying earlier, we have to make sure that the awardees are the awardees who are nominated are really, truly, and genuinely worthy of that award, that they're people of good repute, that we make sure that I don't know if it may be necessary to do some sort of vetting, perhaps to ensure that, people with unsavory characters and so on who may, through the use of their own influence, be able to get themselves nominated, that we make sure that those awardees are really genuine persons who should be entitled to receive those awards, and that we try to keep the standard at a very high level in terms of allocating those awards. And with those few words, Mr. Deputy President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator Nurse. I now recognize Senator Rogers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Good afternoon, fellow honorable members. It is indeed a pleasure to stand and give support to this bill, the Pride of Barbados Award. Much has already been said, and therefore, to follow what has already been established, I'll be very short. I want to commend the government for the introduction of this bill, and I believe that even without realizing, this bill may be driven by something psychological that is taking place around us. And much of it came up today. The need for us to reinvigorate and rediscover ourselves as a people. A sense of nationalism, recognizing that we are in a world now, as we heard earlier, where every nation is looking out for itself. And therefore, we must now dig deep and rediscover who we are, rediscover what I would refer to as the soul of our nation, recognizing that a nation is not simply a group of people somewhere living, but it is a living being, it is a moving thing. Its productivity and everything is driven by every individual in that nation working to his or her best potential. It is also driven by a particular ideology that shapes the nation. And I believe that this Pride of Barbados bill, the name alone, helps us to tap into that national core that is so necessary at this time. I also welcome the name because it gives us an opportunity, as Senator Springer would have just done, to reflect on our past, reflect on the people, the many persons in our past who would have shaped what we are today. And out of that comes a sense that, given our dubious past, sometimes it is very hard for us to see virtue in each other, to see virtue in the person who is just going about his or her ordinary duties within the community. And this bill now gives us an opportunity to recognize that. In another place, at the spiritual level, I will always tell my people, given our past, we cannot depend on Rome or Canterbury to tell us we're good. We have to find virtue in each other. We have to find virtue in the old lady who comes to church religiously every Sunday, the old lady who nurtured her family, the mother who, with 9 children, and I heard very much about it in the other place yesterday, the reference to Edith Clark's book, My Mother Who Fathered Me, and the recognition of those matriarchs who kept our communities together and are still keeping our communities together. This is not to say that there are not men out there who are doing the same. In my position, I get the opportunity to hear a lot about the stories of our people, because when I sit in funerals and listen to the eulogies, our people have come a very long way, and there are some persons that we will never hear about. We'll never have a plaque or a monument erected to them, but their work within the community has shaped what Barbados is. And you sit and you listen to these wonderful stories. And I believe that out of this, in addition to what Senator Franklin would have spoken about in terms of something tangible being given to persons, I also believe that this is an opportunity to write our story. I believe it was our former Prime Minister, the Honorable Owen Arthur, who once said, "We do not write. We do not write enough about ourselves." And this gives us an opportunity to document what has been happening in our community, the social practitioners that have really shaped this nation. Yes, we recognize those who have sat in these honorable chambers and the contributions they would have made. But this particular bill now gives us the opportunity to look at the very micro level of our society and see those persons who are really the engines of what this nation is. It also gives us an opportunity to look back with pride, but also with an understanding of how we can forge a future. at those early pioneers. In the early days of this nation, I'm just going from the post-independence period. I'm not looking at where Senator Franklin would have gone. The post-independence period, the drive that would have pushed those teachers to work just to make sure that their young charges fulfill their potentials. The drive in industry, the zeal that persons had when they believed that this little nation can become one of the greatest in the world. And it is their efforts, their drive, that have brought us where we are. But now as we go forward into the 21st century, I believe there's a link between this bill, and it is a coincidence that it's coming now after we have discussed the EPA bill earlier. Because one of the things about the EPA bill is that Barbados must partner with others if we're going to forge a way in this world. But if we do not know ourselves, we cannot truly form any great links with others. And so this bill also gives us an opportunity to look at what is necessary to develop the type of nation that can help us to take our place on the world stage and to continue to forge our way in this world. And so I hope that out of this bill, something that can come every year at the end of it is some commemorative magazine that documents the stories of the people whom we've honored, so that there'll be a treasure trove of the development of our nation and the history of our peoples, where younger generations can then come and read about what persons have done and what the contributions that persons have made. This bill reminds me of something that I used to teach back in Codrington College some years ago. In the Jewish tradition, wisdom literature started out being a recognition of what persons did at the grassroots level. So the good midwife was wise, the carpenter was a wise man. Everyone who had a skill or a trade and were good at their trade, they were wise people. Then over time, wisdom became lodged in the law of Moses, and only those who knew the law of Moses were considered wise. I believe this bill is calling us back to go back to the grassroots level and recognize the value of every citizen within our country, and those whom we will never hear about, but the community knows. The nation will now have the opportunity to hear and learn and experience. And so with those few words, sir, I support this bill.
Senator Maynard.
Mr. Deputy President, I too rise in my right eye to support this position today. Mr. President, it is interesting that this Senate has been said to be the Senate that is very young, but listening to my colleague speak today proves that it's not really so. I was fortunate to sit on a committee that adjudicated the Caribbean unsung heroes, and I have always been moved by the fact that there are many, many persons who do incredible work all year round without reward or any desire for any honor. And that particular committee, sponsored by a bank, recognized these people. And I never observed when we looked at the scripts that persons were ever nominated by other family members. It was always someone else. And that work continues in the community every day, and it probably speaks to how we should live and could live, maybe if we weren't so involved in technology. And I want to refer back to a national event, not a pleasant one, that happened a couple of weeks ago. I was astounded on the day of the first power cut by the number of children in my development. I thought that there was some gathering, special gathering of children, because they were all outside. And it reminded me of how life was when I was a boy, where the village raised the child. And this bill, in attempting to recognize Barbadians who have contributed in a major way to supporting others and building the country, speaks to why we need to get back to some of the things that we used to do quietly in the community. And I'm not necessarily, Reverend Rogers spoke briefly or mentioned funerals, and I've always been impressed that at funerals you hear these incredible eulogies. Some are not exactly the truth, but most represent, I think, to a large degree, the truth. And I have often felt sad because the people who have departed have never heard how we have felt about the work they did. So hopefully this bill, when it passes, will give the country an opportunity to recognize persons who do such incredible work. It is important, Mr. Deputy President, that we should record some of these things, if not all of them, in writing. And Senator Rogers alluded to this. And it is easy to give an award and it's recorded somewhere in an official document. But unless we write about what is happening, whether it be in electronic form or on paper, and store it, it is forgotten. Or few will remember it. It's part of the human cycle. We come and we go. And we have to have a way of reminding the others who come what has been here before and why we should maintain it. And with those few words, Mr. Deputy President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I was not going to speak on this bill, and then my conscience checked me, Mr. President. I say that because I am a Rotarian, where I was a Rotaractor, and I was an Interactor before that. So for me, the notion of service, and in particular using our motto, service above self, is something that would not have, in principle, allowed me to have a debate of this nature ongoing without adding my voice in support of its importance. Now, Mr. President, there is a saying that we have in Rotary, and we use it often, and we say there's no greater pleasure than giving to those who can give nothing in return. And so in many of the service organizations, many of the community groups, many of the entities that Senator Nurse spoke about in terms of Pinelands Creative Workshop, Israel Level, and all of the others, they put in the effort, Mr. President, into giving to their projects, their communities, to the country, in pursuit of a given ideal, whether it is Kiwanis, Optimist, Lions, all of these service-oriented organizations and individuals, Mr. President, they give to those who, in principle, can give nothing back. And so while I hear the discussion around wanting to give them recognition, let us be clear, Mr. President, that that's not what they signed up for. We don't join a service club, or we don't give to our communities because we want a recognition of some kind, or because we want some kind of award or gift, monetary or otherwise. We give because that is what we see as our duty to self above service above self. That is what we're all called to do. Mr. President, when I stand here, I'm always humbled. I'm always humbled when I listen to people talk about, well, I have done this well, or I've done that well. Someone says to me often, but Lisa, I am always so nervous when I stand up to speak, but you don't ever seem nervous. And I remember having a conversation with one of those persons and saying, I didn't learn to speak publicly with confidence in any formal setting. I learned it from those people who served my community in my Sunday school, who gave of their time to teach us the recitations every evening, and you had to stand up as a little girl, 5 years old, 6 years old, and you had to repeat it. They weren't compensated in any way, Mr. President. They gave of themselves. And we had harvests and Christmas programs and everything that they gave from young people, older people who gave of themselves for no reason other than they felt it was their responsibility to mold, to nurture, to gift. And they gifted a society, generations of young people who in turn, when they became adults, were committed to giving back. Now, why is this important, Mr. President? Now, there's a story about when the Barbados Labour Party was preparing for election 2018 that I'm going to share. Now, this is not a coincidence. This is not an accident. When we were looking at the Barbados Labour Party manifesto, and I was one of those members in the peer review group, there's a section in the manifesto, Mr. President, that the initial developers put in, and it was called National Consciousness. And there were those of us, as community-minded as we are, as much as we spend a significant amount of our time in service to various entities and organizations, we felt, but, you know, Prime Minister, at the time she wasn't Prime Minister, we called her by her name, this is not manifesto-type material. We can't put this in here. No one wants to see that. That's not what you put into a manifesto. That's not the stuff you can campaign on. And she was resolute. She was adamant. She would not be moved. I think her language was something over my dead body when it came out. Something along those lines. Something along those lines. She was very strong about the importance of emphasizing national consciousness. And so, in our manifesto, there is a chapter called National Consciousness. And there she talks about service. We as a party and we as an administration speak about the importance of service. Service to community, service to youth, service to organizations, because that is the bedrock upon which all that we have said so far from all of the members who have spoken before, all of that is what we as a nation are built on. We're built on the Sunday school teachers, Mr. President, who in Mares Road Pentecostal Church would have spent significant amount of time on people like me, Mr. President. We are built on those teachers who spent hours after school in St. George Primary on people like me, Mr. President, in lessons without charge. We're not talking about persons who are being paid for their services. We're talking about people who give of themselves for nothing in return. And that is a phenomenal thing. That is a phenomenal thing in a space in Barbados where what's in it for me has become the norm. And I'm not talking, Mr. President, about big ticket items. I'm talking about the small things that we take for granted that become insidious and then become a custom and practice and become the norm. So, for example, we have this afternoon a young man who is being buried as a result of an unfortunate incident in his school. And there are many adults, Mr. President, who rather than volunteering with their local community group or getting involved in their parish community group to make sure that we have interventions in our communities to help our young people manage issues like conflict resolution, help to teach them emotional intelligence, help to teach them self-confidence and motivation. They're happy to share voice notes, Mr. President. They're happy to share images, Mr. President. They're happy to have all kinds of unproductive conversations that add no value to our communities and to our young people, Mr. President. I want it to be clear that they are part of the problem, Mr. President, and not just the young man who took his life. I want it to be clear that it's not just a question of violence, Mr. President, on the far end of the scale. It is our response to the symptoms of challenges in our community, Mr. President. I want to talk about those persons who, when you have young people who may be involved in a fight, who are comfortable talking about them young people, Mr. President, but those same older persons are those who themselves struggle with conflict resolution and managing relationships effectively. I can't say, Mr. President, that as I drive the roads of Barbados and as I interface in various different spaces, Mr. President, that there is any real difference between some of our older persons in our community and how we manage conflict poorly and some of the young people that we would wish to condemn, Mr. President. There is a need for national consciousness, but there is a need for individual responsibility, Mr. President. If we see the problems in our society that those who went before us saw and develop solutions to fix, like those Sunday school teachers, like those community service members, like those persons that Senator Springer spoke about who taught etiquette and social graces by teaching people how to how to eat with a knife and fork, those kinds of things. If we are not going to be doing those things, Mr. President, and building up our community, then we have no right to tear it down. Mr. President, we are celebrating those people who have given. We are celebrating those people who have built. We are celebrating with this award those people who gave of themselves with an expectation of nothing in return, and they deserve to be celebrated. But this is also an occasion, Mr. Deputy President, for us to call on Barbadians to themselves give more, be more, aspire to more, want more for your young people, want more for yourself. Set an example that people can follow. Because in many instances, Mr. President, we are not laying the foundation for the award of Future Prize of Barbados in the quantum that we really should be laying it, because too many of our elders are not setting the example. Mr. President, I remember this morning as I was on my way to the Senate, I was driving, and there was an older man walking with a hat, and he disembarked his ZR that stopped in the middle of the road, doing the wrong thing, and he continued walking in the middle of the road, completely oblivious to oncoming traffic. I was right behind him, and I didn't flinch, I just drove slowly. He noticed my car, looked back, flared off his hand, and he continued. I hadn't said anything to him. I hadn't tooted my horn. I just had on my poker face, and I left him until he was good and ready to come out of the road, Mr. President. I'm saying here, Mr. Deputy President, that we have to do a better job of managing ourselves, because we have come to a place in this country where there are no rules. Right is wrong, and wrong doesn't matter. We do what we feel like. We don't think of others. And then when others are elevated, we seek to tear down. We seek to attribute all kinds of motives to their elevation other than the fact that they gave of themselves. They gave of themselves. And I'm saying, Mr. Deputy President, that it is in this moment that national consciousness matters. And we're not talking about those only at the top of the scale that are the most visible. I'm talking also about the invisible. So there's a song that I like quite a bit. Everybody knows I like dance hall. It's by Chronix, and it's called I'm a Legend. It says, yesterday I was on a train and a little boy asked me my name. He said, "Sir, I've seen you before, tell me, who are you?" Said, "I am a legend that you never heard of before. I'm a lion, but you never heard me roar. I'm a hero that nobody celebrates. But if one person remembers my name, I know I've made a change." And then he goes on to say, "I'm the man who cooks the food and feeds the street people in the afternoon. I'm the lady with the broom sweeping the halls of your son's preschool. I'm the soldier who's up all night making sure everything is all right. And if you ask me, I'm quite fine being an ordinary person doing what's right." That's what this is about, Mr. President. You are an ordinary person. We are ordinary people doing the right things for the right reasons, with no expectation of an award, but we as a state, we as a nation and as an administration recognize that you are deserving of award. And so for those reasons, Mr. President, I want to say I support this bill. I support what it stands for, and I'm hoping that it is able to trigger among so many in our community the ambition, the aspiration to be that ordinary person doing what's right. And with those few words, I'm obliged.
Mr. Deputy President, much has been said. I need not add much more, other than at this stage to say that as we move into, we gather in 2020 from January of this year, we should do so to celebrate, to inspire, to build community spirit, to encourage engagement, and to uplift, as all of my colleagues around the table have said. And it is with these few words that I beg that this bill be read again a second time.
The question is that the bill be read a second time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Deputy President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself in committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of the bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The House is now in committee. The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 stand part. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 2 stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 stand part. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 3.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 3 stand part.
The question is that Clause 3 stand part. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 4.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 4 stand part.
The question is that Clause 4 stand part. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 5.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 5 stand part.
The question is that Clause 5 stand part. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 6.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 6 stand part.
The question is that Clause 6 stand part. All those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honor, the Deputy President, the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President, the Deputy President, the passing of one bill in committee. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those members against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the award of Pride of Barbados Bill 2019 be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill be read a third time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Deputy President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Award of Pride of Barbados Act 2019.
The question is that the bill do now pass and be cited as the Award of Pride of Barbados Act 2019. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The bill has been passed and will be so cited.
Mr. Deputy President, I beg to move that we now suspend for a period of 10 minutes.
The question is that we do now suspend for 10 minutes. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.